never ceded. And this is Aboriginal land and always will be Aboriginal land. So welcome to Avid Reader for the launch of this beautiful, beautiful book, Ordinary Matter. As you can see, there's a sticker on this book which says signed copy. So that's a rare and wonderful thing in the Zoom universe. We actually have Laura in the same city as us. So she has been able to come in.
Same suburb, really.
Same suburb, just up the road. So she's actually been able to come in and sign some copies. So one of the wonderful things about this particular event is that if you order via our Avid Reader website, you will get 10% off if you use the word event, E-V-E-N-T, at the checkout. And that's not just for Laura's book, but for any other book you put in the cart. So that's 10% off with E-V-E-N-T for the next 24 hours. And this is where you can find Laura's book on this link that I've just shared with you in the chat function. Now, we usually have questions at the end of our events, but we're thinking that because there's quite a lot to get through tonight, and because Ashley has some fascinating questions for Laura, we think that it might be best if you can send some comments through if you like, but I don't think we'll get time for questions tonight. But do feel free to send any comments through that you would like to, and I'll try to get those to Laura after the event. So I'm going to start off now by introducing you to the wonderful Aviva Tuffield, who is the publisher at UQP, and Aviva is going to take over for a minute now. So welcome to Aviva.
Thank you, Chrissy, and thank you all those amazing people who've joined us. It's so many people. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm Zooming from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to thank the inestimable Avid Reader bookstore for all that they do to champion authors, publishers and readers, especially in 2020, this horror year. They could not have, wait for it, pivoted faster or with less fuss to online events and launches, and to finding new ways to support the literary community. So thank you, and thank you, Chrissy. Now to the incredible Laura Elvery. I've been a long-standing admirer of Laura's short stories and was lucky to inherit her as an author when I joined UQP, which had already published her impressive collection, first collection, Trick of the Light. That collection was widely praised and also shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards. When Laura first told me about her idea for her next book, a collection of stories based around the 20 times women have won the Nobel Prize for Science, I was so excited and also pleased for her and us. How good is that elevator pitch? Every time we talked about her superb work in progress, I was blown away by Laura's intellect and by the way her brain works. Most of my role during the writing of this book involved me saying, let's make sure readers are truly getting access to your amazing mind and these ingenious connections between Nobel winners' lives and all their discoveries. In short, pushing Laura to reveal her true brilliance. And wow, did she deliver. This collection is mercurial and wise, intriguing and inspiring, rich and varied, and throughout gloriously written. Each story is a jewel, and placed together, the collection is so much more than the sum of its parts. But don't take my word for it. The glowing reviews are already pouring in. In Books and Publishing, the reviewer said, Elvery's stories are luminescent, sensitive, and insightful. And there was high praise from Susan Medallia in Australian Book Review, who compared the story Wingspan to, and I quote, the best work of Alice Munro. Medallia ends her review thus: Ordinary Matter is, in the best sense, a surprising collection, intellectually ambitious, offering unexpected digressions and deliberately odd conjunctions. It will consolidate Elvery's reputation as a writer of fine short stories. Hear, hear, I could not agree more. Congratulations, Laura. I know these are challenging times in which to be launching a book, especially for someone as loved and admired as you, who could fill Avid many times over in person. We at UQP have no doubt that Ordinary Matter is going to receive many accolades and find a wide and devoted readership, and we couldn't be prouder of you. Back to you, Chrissy, and to that wonderful woman next to you.
Thank you, Aviva.
Oh, my pleasure, Laura.
Thank you, Aviva. That was wonderful. And absolutely, we totally agree that Laura is an amazing writer, and that this is an amazing book. So we think that you have done well to acquire her, because I think that this book is going to
inherit.
It's going to inherit. It's going to knock your socks off, I reckon. So I think
like an old couch.
Like an old couch, that's right. Look, it's now my absolute pleasure to introduce the woman that I have beside me, Dr. Ashley Hay, who is the editor at Griffith Review and who used to write award-winning novels until she got a full-time job. That was very intense. We hope that she will one day write some more. And here is the wonderful Ashley Hay.
Thank you. That's a relatively disarming introduction to come in with. I'm feeling so sneaky being so close to Chrissy Neen and out in the real world. Laura, I'm sorry you're not in this room with us, but it feels pretty amazing.
Up the hill.
Back in Avid, having a conversation and having a conversation about books. Thank you to everyone for coming into the Zoom room. As Chrissy said, my name is Ashley Hay and I am the editor of Griffith Review. I'm particularly delighted to be talking with Laura about this new short story collection this evening. Griffith Review published 2 of these stories, Wingspan and The Town Turns Over, on Laura's journey towards the book. And it was also my very great pleasure and privilege to work with her right at the beginning of her thinking about this. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this conversation is happening, albeit remotely. Laura and I are both south of the Brisbane River on the land of the Yagara people, albeit in our different rooms. But I also would like to acknowledge the elders of this place, past, present and emerging, and First Nations custodianship right across Australia. I think it's extraordinary that we can share stories this way during this time. It's a privilege, but it's important to acknowledge all
I agree. Thanks, Ash.
across the continent. So Laura is, as we know, and have already said, an award-winning writer of short stories. Her first collection, Trick of the Light, was published only 2 years ago in 2018, and now Ordinary Matter is here. We're going to talk into the book a little bit now, and then we're going to do a couple of little speechy things. Laura's going to do a reading for you on the way through as well. So I would like to go back, Laura, to the beginning of our conversations about these stories, because I can remember sitting in a room upstairs at the State Library of Queensland with the river outside, and I can remember the first time that you described your idea for this collection, and I had this immediate sense of potential and excitement in terms of how lateral you wanted this collection, these imaginings to be. So it sort of feels important to lay out a bit of groundwork about what the book is not, because the book is not a series of stories about women who've won Nobel Prizes, but rather a series of stories inspired by these women, these 19 women whose scientific work has been celebrated 20 times by the awarding of one of Alfred Nobel's famous prizes. And the 1920 thing, of course, is Marie Curie, who's pretty amazing. Before we start to explore these women and these stories in particular, can we go right back to the beginning and whatever it was that gave you that first sort of impetus or spark, not to look at these women, but to look at what might sit around them?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. Yeah, I do remember that really well when we sat at State Library. I think I'd sort of bought your time. I was like, I need to pay someone to talk to me. All my writer friends are a bit over it. So I had this mentorship and we met maybe like 5 times for 2 hours each. And I do remember sitting there with you and sort of it was almost like I was asking, what could this be? This is my idea, but I'm not sure how I'm going to go about it. This was really early days for me. And I knew I didn't want to do biographies of the women. And I knew that I didn't want it to be, I'd started writing a couple where I thought, okay, if Gertie Corey won in 1947, then I need to set her story in 1947. And if Dorothy Hodgkin won in 1965, then okay, let's start writing a 1965 story. And I'd started doing that and I just felt really stymied and it just wasn't working. And, you know, it felt really creaky to write like that. And, you know, when you're embarking on a project, if you feel too creaky at the outset, then you either give up or you have to find a way out of it. And I think the way out of it was talking with you and my writers group. And so I sort of said to them, what could this be? Because I mean, I love short fiction, obviously, and I love linked short story collections. So at the outset, there were a couple that went in really creative ways. So Ceridwen Dovey's Only the Animals, which has that link of, you know, first person, the souls of animals who've died in human conflict, and Laura Elizabeth Woolett's Love of a Bad Man. So I'd sort of had these collections as touchstones. So I needed to figure out how I would do mine. And I remember going to my writers group and just trying to brainstorm and brainstorming with you, what could it be? And so I guess to move away from that idea of biographies, which I didn't want to do. And I also didn't want to write 20 eureka stories, you know, 20 stories where I saw this woman at the lab, you know, eureka or whatever. And I didn't want 20 stories of women filing across the stage in Stockholm, like, no thanks. So I think at the outset, our discussions were like, this person, I've found this really interesting clue or a line from this person's childhood. Is that anything? Could that be a story? And so it was about filling out, like I had a spreadsheet with each woman and, you know, the year she won and where she was born. And I think I was really just, you know, jumping in and out of these, well, then it was 18 women, but jumping in and out all the time, trying to find little clues that I could sort of latch onto so that the writing would feel exciting for me to work on as a whole project.
I want to come back to that idea of accretion, because I think that's a really interesting way to make fiction. And I want to come back to that a bit later on. But let's talk first of all about Wingspan, which I think was the first of the stories in the series that...
Yeah, it was.
Right?
Yeah.
And this imagines a night in the life of a character called Elizabeth, and its story steps out from the prize awarded to the Australian molecular biologist Elizabeth Blackburn for her work.
I like that. Steps out. That's nice.
Steps out. That's my thing. Laura Elvery. So in Wingspan, there's a young girl called Elizabeth who's in Launceston in Tasmania, and she's waiting for a friend, and she's waiting for a mother's friend to turn up, and the mother's friend is going to draw the children, and she's waiting for this magical thing to happen. Her uncle's going to fly over in an aeroplane. How did this Elizabeth come to you? And was it through her that you started to see all of the women as potential material in a way? Yeah,
probably. Yes. And so that first story, that I wrote that for Griffith Review. I think before you were there, Ash, I pitched, you know, like I needed an idea. I wanted some grant money. So you come up with an idea as you're writing the grant. Oh, I could write a story about her. And it was going to be a completely different story about Elizabeth Blackburn. But Wingspan does step out from her, and it's definitely not Elizabeth Blackburn. Like the real Elizabeth Blackburn has like 6 siblings. And this Elizabeth is sort of, I think of her as a little parallel Elizabeth, a little para-Elizabeth. And she's got 1 sibling, the real Elizabeth Blackburn in Tasmania. Both her parents were doctors, and I've given her father this, he's a surgeon, he's a doctor, and the mother is at home. So I took some details. She was born in Hobart, but she spent most of her childhood in Launceston. So I took some things and completely diverged in other respects, because I did want it to be this story of Elizabeth and her mother Val. And so the story flits between the two of them. And the other thing that was really central to that story is I was reading, there's a biography of Elizabeth Blackburn by Catherine Brady, and there's a line in it. And a lot of these women scientists, when you research them, were obviously, you know, interested in animals, interested in the natural world, things like that. And there's a line in that biography where Elizabeth Blackburn was obsessed with this backyard pond she had. And so I had this image of a little girl looking over a pond, seeing some tadpoles, and just being quite astonished by this change that wasn't quite happening before her eyes, but close to it. And so that forms part of the story, is who's this parallel Elizabeth, and how does a little girl become interested, and she's not on the character in the story is interested in so many things. She's very curious about lots of things. But in writing that story, which, yes, was the very first one I wrote, and it's the longest in the book, which was always, not everything I do is intentional, but that was intentional, that, Elizabeth Blackburn's the only Australian Nobel laureate in any field, literature, economics, anything. And I didn't know of her name until I started researching this. And some people have heard of Elizabeth Blackburn, but I hadn't. And I thought, that's very interesting to me. And she's still working and seems like a really unassuming and brilliant mind. And I wanted to capture that. And it gave me real creative space to keep going with the others.
There's a really particular kind of creativity involved in imagining or in creating this kind of not real life. I like that parallelism. It's great. Were there particular moments of inspiration, or did you need a sort of imaginative permission to go into this space? Was Elizabeth Blackburn a sort of particular portal in that way as well?
Yeah, she was. And Aviva touched on it before. When I presented the book to UQP, I think I'd gone so far away from this idea of it being biographies that the stories were really loosey-goosey, some of them. And some of them are in the book, which is exactly how I want them to be. So the shaping during the editing and the publication of it, the publishing process, really was that some of these stories where the woman appears, those are really vital for the collection as a whole. So we do see Rosalind Yallow the night before she collects her medal in Stockholm. And we do see Marie Curie in the second story, Grand Canyon, although she doesn't speak, but we see her from afar and she's in the story. And I mean, I had no preference. Like, I really enjoyed writing those ones where you're bound by a few historical landmarks. And then I also really enjoyed writing some of them. Irene Curie won in 1933, but her story, Something Close to Gold, is set on the Sunshine Coast, give or take now, basically. So I really enjoyed being able to do that as well, or finding something about their research. Gertrude Elion used to receive all these hundreds and hundreds of letters from families whose children, her drugs had ended up saving their lives. And I thought that was really interesting. So the story that is devoted to her is about a family with a loved one who's, dying of cancer. So I did enjoy stepping out, and some I came to straight away and some took ages and ages.
I'm interested in the appropriation of the term loosey-goosey for literary criticism.
Loosey-goosey, you can have it.
In a big way. Thank you so much. I wanted to say, though, with some of the other real people that pop up in the fiction, and this is partly to link into the reading that I know you'd like to do, which is from a beautiful story, The Garden Bridge, which I think was one of the first ones that I read when you were working on the collection, or maybe it's just that you spoke about it so vitally that I've had it so clearly in my head. But one of the real people in this particular piece is an architect who built, the fabulous sort of beehive building that's in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about those sort of other insertions or invasions, maybe, of bits and pieces of truth? And then I think you'd like to read a bit of the opening of the Garden Bridge for us as well.
Yeah, they doing that little invasion, that's really fun for me. So the Garden Bridge came about, it's a pretty typical way I think I write a story, where I have lots of different scenes or lines that I've overheard, and I think, well, that in itself is not a story, but if I put that with this, so I'd been reading an article in the New Yorker about Thomas Heatherwick, again, someone I hadn't really heard of, and it was about that beehive, which is in the Hudson Yards, I think, in New York. And I was just like, who is this man? And the article gave this real sense of someone who was a maverick, who some people really detested, and others really admired his artistic vision. And so that was sort of one thing that was in my head, Ash. And then I was at a party and I overheard someone who had been working at a dentist surgery, and she said something about a small child and teeth. And that sort of came into my head. And then the garden bridge, which I had heard of, was this idea that Boris Johnson and some celebrities, some odd celebrities in London, had this idea to build this real bridge. Cost millions and millions of pounds just to get that idea, even just to sort of an architect stage. And you can see the pictures of it, the artist's impression of it. And part of me, I guess, was like, it was never built. It was almost built, but never. And part of me, I think, for that story was thinking, it is lovely to build really beautiful things. Like, it's a footbridge, and you see pictures of it, and it's trees and flowers, and it's just beautiful. And then the other part of me is like, what an absolute folly, what an indulgent thing for people to do in post GFC London. So I could see it. And then I just tried to imagine, okay, it didn't happen in 2013, but what if it happened in the future when some egomaniac decides to fund the whole thing himself? And that's how the garden bridge smushed together.
Do you want to read a little bit from that story?
Sure. So this is Carol Greider. This steps out from Carol Greider's life. This is her story, the garden bridge. The summer was long and reminded everyone of global warming, and no one knew how to enjoy it. Lucy saw a small boy releasing water from a tap in St. James's Park, his golden dog lapping at it. All across the city, galleries were full. Irritated couples and young parents with strollers prickled in agitation that others had the same idea about using the cool spaces inside the National Portrait Gallery as respite from the heat. Exhibitions were at capacity, but people let out soft sighs like they were turning over in bed. No one really paid attention to the things on the walls. Then it was winter. Evenings arrived early and the nights were cold. London in December, one Friday afternoon. Lucy stood at the bench examining images of the lower jaw of her young patient while the girls spat water into the yellowed sink. Her mother dashed up to Lucy, throbbing with panic. I don't want her to have a big, risky anaesthetic. Mrs. Paulson had wild dark hair and eyes to match. Well, Lucy said, I'm not keen on pulling out a child's entire set of teeth without pain relief. 4 years old and with 20 teeth that needed extracting because Mrs. Paulson still breastfed her through the night. Lucy forced a smile. For the rest of the afternoon, Lucy tried to suppress her judgment, but she marvelled at the woman's carelessness. She sent the paperwork out to Genevieve, the clinic's nurse, underlining a significant discount to get the whole thing sorted. If Mrs. Paulson didn't want Lucy to do it, Genevieve could suggest other clinics, some with qualified dentists, but none without risk. Lucy treated 4 more patients, 2 of whom asked, not without dignity, if they could pay another time. She made a cup of tea. She remembered the strange message from last night that she hadn't yet answered, but pushed the thought away. She unboxed rows of extracting forceps in crackling sterile packages and slim boxes of mirrors, stowing the rubbish in the clinic's 300-litre aquarium that had once kept tropical fish. She tried to scrub the sink clean. Icy air and sharp wind, evidence of the season, no matter how short, hit Lucy and Genevieve outside the clinic at 5 o'clock. On Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, the city switched on the street lights. Today, soft glows of light glowed along the darkening street. Lucy buttoned her coat and waved goodbye, then, remembering, turned on her heel and doubled back to see if Genevieve had rebooked the Paulson girl. Genevieve palmed her cheek, annoyed with herself. She'd do it first thing Monday. Lucy headed for home, where she dropped her bag on the bedroom floor and went into the tiny bathroom and took off her coat, then her cardigan, then unbuttoned her shirt, then shed her bra and searched out the lump in her left breast with the fingers of her right hand. All day she worked on people's teeth, attended to their worries. Hour upon hour, her mind tamped down on others' pain. But in the lulls between patients, she met herself in the mirror of the clinic, and her mind dilated with despair, remembering the corrupted cells incubating under her skin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
It gets a bit better from there.
let's go back to the other beginning of this book, which sits with Marie Curie, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1903 and then for chemistry in 1911. Now, I know you've just done your reading, but I'd like to read the note that you give us for the first story in the book. So the stories follow the chronology of the women, but that's not necessarily the chronology of the settings of the stories themselves. Yep. So the note for this book, you say, 100 years after Marie Curie became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, Paris, like much of Europe in the summer of 2003, sweltered through a record-breaking heatwave. At this time, the French government relaxed environmental laws to allow cooling water from nuclear reactors to be released into waterways at a higher temperature than normal. Marie was co-awarded the Nobel for her extraordinary research into radiation after her husband, Pierre, insisted her name be included on the prize. In 1906, Pierre stepped onto a street in Paris and was struck and killed by a horse and cart, leaving behind Marie and their 2 daughters. Now, this is like, it's like a little haiku. It's like this tiny little perfect, elegant, jeweled thing in and of itself. And all of the notes are, in a way. And this story sort of hovers alongside the beautifully titled first story, which is called You Run Towards Love. And there are beautiful lines that sort of run out from these very specific facts that you've pinned in the note to your story of 2 people traveling to Paris in the summer of 2003. And, this wonderful sense in the title. We've talked a little bit about the way you pulled in these correspondences and these coincidences between fact and your fiction. But I wonder if the facts gave the fiction a different potential and a different authority, in a sense, if it felt to you like a kind of empowering thing to be pulling the real world into the world that you were creating in a way.
Yeah, so that first story, I was really keen to see what was happening, what Paris did to sort of celebrate Marie Curie on the centenary of her winning. I didn't know if they'd done anything. And I found 2003, that European heatwave, lots of people died. The Minister for Health went off to the Alps, went skiing. This was all written before the bushfires when people are leaving. Yeah, so he goes off and then that image of Pierre having that accident that ended his life in 1906. And the other thing I was thinking for that first story, Ash, is because I knew that was going to be the order of the stories, it wasn't like Trick of the Light where we arranged the contents kind of at the end. And this really interesting, fun job to do. Which order should these 24 stories go in? But for this, I knew quite early on that they would be set out in the book year by year. That first story, I think anyway, needs to open up the collection in such a way that it reveals sort of the tone or reveals some of the concerns that might come up, might crop up a little bit. And I also think that first story, in my mind, speaks to the last story of the book, that it's bookended by these 2 women facing some environmental crises at different points in time. And the tragedy of what happened to Pierre Curie, I was really lucky. I got to go to Stockholm in December, which was feels really bizarre that I even ever got to do that now. And I went to the Nobel Prize Museum and I sat down with these 2 wonderful curators there, Usa and Karen. And I said, oh, isn't it amazing? Marie Curie's name was going to be left off, she was going to be denied that first medal in 1903. And I said, and then her husband really advocated for her, highlighting how much of that work was actually hers. And they were very quick. They were these Swedish women, and they said yes. And this Swedish mathematician as well, who was a real proponent of women in science, and he really lobbied the Nobel Committee as well. And they were very proud of this fact that these few people had sort of rallied around her justly, and she was named on that award as well in 1903. So those little bits fed into that first story on this really hot day in Paris, this really hot evening. And we know these two people have a history, but we don't quite know how yet.
There's an amazing power in the fact, I think you said it yourself a moment ago, that, you know, we see Marie Curie in Grand Canyon, but she doesn't speak. She's just sort of there. And instead, that story sits more with her daughters. So in Grand Canyon, Marie Curie is successful. She's won her second Nobel Prize by this stage, but she's absolutely destitute. And so this extraordinary American journalist basically crowdfunds the $100,000 that Marie Curie needs for 1 gram of radium to keep her research going. And Marie Curie travels to the US with her daughters to, you know, kind of meet these. But the story, the life in the story sits with Frank, this kind of everyman guy who, you know, is driving them around and making sure they get to where they need to go and get them to the Grand Canyon. And I think the thing that is most extraordinary in this story, but it's in all your stories, is the detail. The detail just shimmers off the page. Like, I've never seen the Grand Canyon, but I saw it through Frank's eyes. And I cannot remember the last time I drank warm Coca-Cola, but I could taste it in Frank's mouth. And all these little sort of sensory, you know, he's in the mansion of Mrs. Carnegie, and the details that he notices and how he reacts to them. Can we talk a little bit about just that work of bringing those details, the smells and the sights and the sounds, just, you know, they come off the page. They're absolutely magnificent. That must be just such a lovely sort of space to play in, to do that.
It is, Ash. Thank you. Oh, that's so nice that you love that. Thank you. I love doing that sort of like, what ice cream did people eat in 1920? I love that stuff. And then you get to spend 4 hours finding out what ice cream everyone ate and what does a menu on a ship look like in 19. I love that stuff. You sort of totally not doing any work, but you're actually kind of doing a little bit of work. And yeah, so I wanted this other character, like you say, Nobel Prize, and people do know Marie Curie. And so for that story to work, there had to be a man who absolutely felt like the opposite of a celebrity, but somehow is in this orbit of these 3 women, one of whom he is sort of obsessed with and adores and finds very beautiful. And he's seeing his life change a little bit over the time, and he's sort of obliterated by the size of things and feels both very small and very large. But yeah, the crowdfund thing, all those sort of details, like this journalist wanted to raise $100,000. She asked 10 rich women in America. She couldn't find 10 women to give $10,000 each. So she just asked all of American women and came up with $100,000 to buy this single gram. And so, yes, that story has its points in some specific things that did happen. They did travel, and that's a huge distance. Marie Curie was already ill. She was exhausted. She didn't really seem to like hanging out with people in a road trip to the Grand Canyon. That doesn't seem to be her thing. But she did it for this gram, and she maybe did it for her daughters as well, perhaps. And so all these little pockets of things that are real, and then you get to research, yes, the ice cream and how much is a bottle of Coca-Cola at a kiosk. And I love that sort of stuff. Yeah. That's really fun.
So I want to come back to the mothers and daughters as well, because they're a particular thing. And I could honestly we could walk through story by story in this book quite happily, but the Zoom room might empty after a while. I do want to stay with the order in the book just for a moment. I promise we'll kind of leap forward after that. The next story in the running order belongs to Irene, Marie Curie's daughter. And I have to say, it is one of just the most haunting and enigmatic things. It's just beautiful. It's called Something Close to Gold. And it speaks a little bit to the coincidence of Irene Curie winning the award that her mother had won 2 decades before her. But as you said, I think this story sits in a sort of a now. It's just up the coast from Brisbane on the Sunshine Coast. And it's the story of a couple who dream of becoming parents. and who kind of do in a really interesting way. But you begin it with the story of the whale, Tahlequah, who was observed pushing her dead calf along the shoreline of British Columbia for 17 days back in 2018.
You'll make us all cry. 122 people, Ash. Thanks.
Well, Tahlequah, of course, popped into the news this week because there she was with her very healthy, very alive new calf swimming around. Now, that is a story to love on so many levels. But what I want to talk about in the context of something close to gold and Tahlequah is this a sort of sense of almost supernatural isn't the right word, maybe supernatural is better, coincidence at work. Now, I know that some writers have these moments where they feel like bits of their fiction come to life and manifest in the real world. Did you have moments when you were piecing these chapters together when the world would sort of show you something like Tahlequah turning this week? Just those little kind of almost too good to be true intersections of what was inside your head and what was happening somewhere.
Yeah, I love that story, and it makes me cry if I read that story about that poor whale. And I'd heard that story being told at Brisbane Writers Festival a couple of years ago. And there's this man, David, and I can't remember his last name, and he writes about like Trump and orca whales. Someone will know his last name. And he was speaking with Philip Hoare, who also writes about whales at Brisbane Writers Festival. And I'd heard him tell this story, you know, bawling my eyes out. And a week later, I had the voice of the main character in Something Close to Gold, totally separate, but I had an idea for a character. That story came out of an idea for a character who is down on her luck a little bit, feels like the world is a little bit against her, the universe. She keeps thinking about the universe and what it hasn't given her or what it has given her. And you're right, it's sort of like it was already in my brain, but it re-fell into my brain, Ash, I guess, in that a week earlier, I'd heard this person speak at Brisbane Writers Festival about this orca, and how in the same way that it sort of came back to me, it comes back to the character in the story when she's thinking about this baby that she wants so much, and she's thinking about how motherhood might change her and what it would mean to gain something she wants so badly and then to potentially lose it, like our poor friend did in the ocean.
What were the most exciting discoveries that you made, or who were the characters that surprised you the most as they emerged to fill up this collection?
I'll tell you what's interesting, I think. Well, so many things, Ash, so many things, is I keep thinking, and when I went and saw these curators at the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm, is I was kind of struck, and we just sort of gossiped for an hour about all this sort of exciting stuff, is that the Nobel Prize like almost didn't happen. And I think that's really interesting to me. So Alfred Nobel, in April 1888, he read this little line in a French newspaper, Le Figaro, right down the bottom, but on the page one, that said something like, a man who was no friend to humanity has died in Cannes. It was Mr. Nobel, inventor of dynamite. He was Swedish, he's died. And then another paper picked it up and said, merchant of death has died. And the man who made killing people quicker than any other thing has gone from this earth. So poor Alfred, who's totally alive, sees it, feels very much alive. His friends contact him. And the next day the newspaper has to go, sorry, that was his brother who died. But upon seeing this little obituary that was about him, but not about him, he kind of reevaluated his life and became sort of obsessed with this idea of legacy. Didn't want that to be his legacy. And so about 7 years later, the year before he died, he did rewrite his will. Didn't really tell people about it. Didn't tell the academies that were going to end up giving out millions and millions and millions of dollars, because he didn't have a wife, didn't have children, but he was kind of a poet. And that's why they think the Literature Prize is in there. And perhaps the Peace Prize as well, because of that idea of legacy. Maybe he was like, you know, merchant of death, I'll show you. But like, Ash, like what if a copy editor had picked up that line in the obit before it went to print, like, oh, Alfred or Ludwig, like, which one is it? That is totally, that blows my mind, that might never have happened. He might never have changed, and he made millions of dollars in oil and dynamite and military explosives. So I find that fascinating, that the world would be a really different place if someone had like picked up on this mistake on this paper. That blows my mind. Yeah.
I think that is the perfect kind of incident and epiphany, isn't it? And I think, you know, I think there is a wonderful sense of Alfred and just the destructiveness of what he did create that kind of, you know, ebbs and flows in so many of the stories. There are these sort of little moments of not destruction, but threat or danger, or, well, there are explosions, you know, but there is that beautiful sense that, yes, the women sort of sit across everything, but also Alfred runs through too. And I just got one eye on the time and all the things, you know, we want to do and say. But I want to ask you one more question before we do the sort of speechy bit. One of the stories in the book is called Growth, and it is about Rita Levi-Montalcini and her sister, Paola. And we meet them through the eyes of a character who is very disillusioned but very clear-eyed PhD student. She's writing about representations of play. And she tells us very directly some of Rita's story through a documentary that she. And at the end of Growth, you write, or the character says in her voice, I see the pair of them, Rita and Paola, bent towards each other in youth and beyond, so connected and loving. I see them hunted by those tyrants from place to place. They cared for each other and fed each other. Both of them outlived those terrible men. Now, it's not just a curatorial choice to focus on the 20 times a woman has won the Nobel Prize for scientific research, of course, and there's a sort of ferocious power in several of the stories in terms of exploring what these women, the women you're bringing to the page and the women that inspire it, what they have to risk, what they have to forward, what they have to overcome to do the things that they do. How did speaking sort of for or through these women power the stories that you wanted to tell?
With that, thanks, Ash. With that, danger does run through the whole collection, maybe because I'm a total worrier about every minute of the day, always worrying about catastrophes that can befall me or other people. But that Growth was the final story. I think it was the final one I wrote. And my very good writing friend, Sean, just kind of suggested to me that I be a bit direct about a few things, and that readers, I mean, all of these women's lives are so, I could go on about them for days, but Rita's life, the things she really did have to overcome, being chased by these men and packing up her lab, and then instead of just giving up like I probably would just give up, she sets up a lab in her bedroom, and then she sets up a lab in the basement, and there are bombs falling, you know, like that sort of determination, I think, runs through the stories, and that resilience. And then, yeah, damn it, she lived to 103. She outlived Hitler, she outlived Mussolini, and she dropped nerve growth factor into her eyeballs every day, which she says in this documentary, this spindly little woman, he's like, oh, how do you stay young? And she's like, I put it in my eyeballs. And she says it kept her young, and maybe it did. And, you know, there was something in someone like her who overcame many, many things. And then at the end of her life had this seemingly blissful time with her sister and living in Rome and living till 103. So overcoming real threats in history, and then this parallel story of this PhD student who, and that's a jab at myself. The name of her thesis is a bit of a jab at the sort of thesis I wrote. What's the point? She's thinking, what's the point? I'm not curing anything. I'm writing this thesis about, you know, I'm very proud of my thesis, but, you know, she's having these moments of what's the point It's not useful. If we're not doing this medical research, what's the point? If we're not saving the world, what's the point? And that's something that she's grappling with while she's obsessed, because as you can see, I get obsessed with things, while this character is obsessed with Rita's life at this point in her, you know, jacaranda season, exam season in Brisbane. Yeah.
I love that that little nudge from your writing buddy to be a bit more direct, because that story it's just, you know, it says so much about what so many of the stories are talking about in the book, and she's just on the page, you know, your whole or her whole voice and syntax and everything is just present and clear and honest and sort of fierce, which I think is fantastic.
Very fierce. I'd say she was a force to be reckoned with. I'd say all of these women. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no time to ask you many of the questions that I have here. I'm very sorry. But I'm sorry because I did want to sort of loop back to one more question about Elizabeth Blackburn, but I'm not going to. The reason that I was doing that was as a pure setup, because I wanted to
set me up.
I wanted to set you up. I wanted to talk to you about, you know, your Elizabeth tossing up between being a scientist and an artist, but I'm just going to let that hang for the next conversation. The reason I wanted to finish with Elizabeth, though, was because I wanted, in a sense, to let Elizabeth Blackburn herself do the launching. So I want to thank you, Laura, for the words, not just in the book, which are just so stunning and so moving and so powerful, but also all the things that you've talked with us about tonight. And as I say, it felt appropriate to let Elizabeth Blackburn send you off into the world. And I found this fantastic description where she described seeing telomerase for the first time. And she said, I remember just looking at it and thinking, this could be very big. This looks just right. And she said it had a pattern to it. There was a regularity to it. There was something that was not just sort of garbage. It had a sort of sense. And she thought, there's something real here. And then she said, of course, the good scientist has to be very skeptical and immediately say, okay, we're going to test this every way we can and really nail this one way or the other. Because she said, if it's going to be true, you have to make sure that it's true. You can get a lot of false leads when you want something to work.
Yeah.
Now,
I love that quote, Ash.
So many parallels between these feelings and these observations and this combination of work and optimism and observation and wonder that Elizabeth Blackburn is describing. And I think not just in the stories that you've brought into the page for us in Ordinary Matter, but the very work and craft that you've poured into bringing them into being. I think it's part of what makes this book and makes you as a writer so exciting and inspiring to read. So it is a complete pleasure to launch Ordinary Matter into the world. I know it will behave itself very well out there and find a lot of readers. I also know it's very exciting because I know Laura, and I know that if she's finished this one, it means she's working on the next one for us, and that is very exciting.
My editor's right there. Of course I am.
As well. Huge love and congratulations on this book, Laura. It is a beautiful, beautiful thing, and I'm going to let you do your
Ash.
Speechy bit now.
Thank you, Ash. Hello, everyone. I haven't, thank you so much for that. I haven't been looking at all the faces because it'll freak me out. So I've just got a few people that I've been staring at the whole time. But I did write a launch speech, and I really want to thank Aviva for your beautiful words, and Ash for those lovely questions, but more on that later. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to read out a few thank yous, if that's okay. I want to thank you all very much for celebrating with me tonight, from wherever you are. I wish I was at Avid, obviously, but the evening is just so special to me. It's probably hard for any of us to say what we thought this year would look like compared to how it's actually turned out. But I do feel really, really lucky to be here with all of you. And I'm thinking of my loved ones propped up in bed with a little blanket on your knees. And I'm thinking of you from Townsville to Toowoomba and to Perth and Sydney and Melbourne, and then all the way over in London and Wroclaw and in Copenhagen as well. That's a very nice thought. I'm also sending my love to those who are doing it tough right now, and I hope things get better for you soon. Thank you for hitting that registration button on avidreader.com. And if you're anything like my dear friend Holly, coming to your very first somehow Zoom meeting of the year, or perhaps it's your 500th, like mine, Zoom meeting. Thank you. Thank you to Fiona Stager and Chrissy Neen and the whole Avid Reader team for hosting. I read my writing for the very first time at Avid Reader in 2012. Thank you for supporting Brisbane writers and those beyond. And wherever you are, please buy books from your local bricks and mortar bookshop. I'm really grateful to Dr. Ashley Hay for launching not just one, but both of my books now. That's 2 out of 2, Ash, thank you. Thank you for your time 3 years ago when we started talking about this book. And thank you for your time tonight and all the time in between as well. Big thanks to all the superstars at UQP, especially my brilliant editor, Kathy Valence, who I can see there. You're one of the few people I can see, and I really miss seeing you and eating chips while we edit. My calm and hardworking publicist, Jean Smith, and my passionate publisher, Aviva Tarfield. Aviva first emailed me in October 2013. I checked my emails last night, asking about my writing and did I have anything to show her, which is lovely. In the years since, she's been unfailingly supportive of me as a person and steadfast and enthusiastic about my writing. I'm so glad we worked together on Ordinary Matter. Thank you for your lovely speech earlier. And thank you to all the people at UQP who are just wonderful. Ordinary Matter is a book about women, and I'm lucky to have so many good eggs in my life. I'd like to thank a few special ones. Mirandi Rewo, Emma Doolan, and Kate Zahnleider are in particular marvellous writing friends and emotional supporters. Big thanks to Brooke Davis, Abigail Ullman, Keridwin Dovey, and Toni Jordan. Yesterday, my beautiful sister drove me around to bookstores and took 100,000 photos of me and waited in loading zones so we didn't get parking tickets. So that tells you everything you need to know about my sister, Giselle. Thank you. Thank you, Mum and Dad, for being good and generous in every way, and particularly for responding without any question to very random text messages from me while I'm writing, like, did you eat custard in the 60s? And they just answer it. Thank you to my wonderful husband, Simon, who reminds me I can do anything I want and then gives me the time to do it. To my daughter, Harriet, who's been telling me all week how proud she is of me. This book is for her. And beautiful baby boy Theo is a toddler, so he's no help at all. He's a total hurricane. But I wrote heaps of this book while he was much smaller and asleep. So for that, he gets a lot of credit. And I'm just going to finish now by re-quoting the late Corey Taylor, who says in her memoir something that speaks to me always, but especially in 2020. Writing, even if most of the time you are only doing it in your head, shapes the world and makes it bearable. Thank you all very, 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 very much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Laura. That was wonderful, and thank you, Ash. That was such an amazing event. It was, as Kate Mildenhall said, a masterclass in writing. So I'm sure that everyone is going to cheers to you, and we're going to tune in later and listen to it on YouTube. And to finish off tonight, I'm going to open up the room so you will all be able to unmute yourselves.
And now we'll look at everyone.
A final clap. It's been fantastic. Do make sure that you buy her book. You can buy a signed copy from Avid, or if you happen to live in Melbourne, please think about supporting your local bookstore down there, because I know
you're all there.
Melbourne are doing it tough. And now we're going to open the room. Yay. Allow participants to unmute themselves, and we're going to clap.
Yay! Well done.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Love you, Laura.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Love you, Mirandi. Love ya.
Excellent.
See you all. See you later.
Yeah, congratulations, Laura.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Laura.
Congratulations.